Okay, perfect. I think it is 11 o'clock and we are now live on YouTube. So welcome everybody to the colloquium. Everyone can hear me okay? We're in good shape? Okay, very good. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So it is my pleasure to welcome everybody to our colloquium today. We are very honored to have Jason M. Wirth visit us and give a talk on Schelling and Merleau-Ponty. So I'll begin by introducing the speaker and then say a few words about the overarching context in which the talk is taking place. So Dr. Jason Wirth is professor of philosophy at Seattle University, where I believe he is still the chair of the department. Some of this information is
Unfortunately, yes, unfortunately.
okay. Okay. All right. Yes, your desire for power is where it needs to be there. And he is also has an associate appointment in film studies. He's also the associate editor and book review editor of the Journal of Comparative and Continental Philosophy. And I just also like to note, just to give a more kind of well-rounded picture of Jason, he was ordained in 2010 in Japan as a priest in the Soto Zen lineage, and founder and co-director of the Seattle University Eco Sangha. So I know Jason from his really good work on Schelling and Kyoto School. But as I was looking at the full range of his work and research interests, I discovered that he works on many other areas, both historically and systematically. He works on German philosophy from Kant to the present, comparative philosophy, especially Mahayana Buddhist philosophy, aesthetics, film philosophy, and contemporary French philosophy, ecological ethics, Africana philosophy, and others. There's a lot of publications, so I won't name all of them, but I'll just talk about a few, and one that's forthcoming. So there's a forthcoming work that Wirth has done with Alexander Bilda and David Krell. It's a translation of Schelling's On the Deities of Samothrace. And that's coming out in October, right, Jason?
Yeah, maybe sooner, but October at the
Yeah.
very latest.
Okay, so fingers crossed that we get that sooner rather than later. So I'm really excited about that translation. Some recent books include Nietzsche and Other Buddhas, Philosophy After Comparative Philosophy, Mountains, Rivers, and the Great Earth, reading Gary Snyder and Dogen in an Age of Ecological Crisis, monograph on Milan Kundera, Commiserating with Devastated Things, Schelling's Practice of the Wild, and a co-edited volume with Brett Davis and Brian Schroeder, Japanese and Continental Philosophy, Conversations with the Kyoto School. So just to personalize things a little bit here, I first met Jason in 2017, I think it was. It seems like it wasn't that long ago, but due to COVID, it actually was a long time ago, at the North American Schelling Society meeting in Mexico City, where he actually first informed me about an important book by Ueda Shitsutaro on Meister Eckhart, of which there's a chapter comparing Zen and Eckhart. In this chapter, I recently translated from German to English and was able to publish in his journal, Comparative and Continental Philosophy. And since then, I've had the
Very good
privilege.
translation.
Oh, thank you,
Very
Jason.
good translation.
Thank you. I had some good input from really highly qualified people too. So I think in the end, it was a group group project. Since then, I've had the privilege of working with him on a number of projects. He contributed a chapter on absolute negation in Schelling and Nishitani for a volume I edited a couple years ago, Being of Negation in Post-Kantian Philosophy. He's also contributed a chapter on Schelling and Nishitani for a forthcoming volume that I'm editing with Takeshi Morisato at Edinburgh on the dialectics of absolute nothingness, legacies of German philosophy in Kyoto School. So it goes without saying, I'm really happy to have you with us here today, Jason. So maybe just a couple words about the context of this talk. We have a regular colloquium series at CUHK that this is a part of, but there's an added kind of element of context here. Over the past, I suppose it's been 4 months now, Hayden Key and I, Hayden, would you let everyone know who you are? There he is. Organize a reading group at CUHK on the intersection of Schelling and Merleau-Ponty. And we wanted to complete the reading group with a guest lecture by a scholar who has worked at that intersection and on that intersection. And so because Jason has done some important work on the relationship between Schelling and Merleau-Ponty, we thought it'd be a really good idea to invite him to come talk with us. So you can also see his book that he edited with Patrick Burke, I believe, The Barbarian Principle, Merleau-Ponty, Schelling, and the Question of Nature. So if you want to read more about this connection, if you're inspired by the talk, you can go follow up there. That was, I think, 2013 with SUNY. So we are really looking forward to learning more about the relationship between Schelling and Merleau-Ponty. And today his talk appears to be intimately related to the final text that we read for our reading group, The Philosopher and His Shadow. The title of the talk today is The Psychoanalysis of Nature During the Anthropocene. Merleau-Ponty reads Schelling. So welcome, Jason. Thanks so much for being here, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Greg. Thank you, Hayden. Thank you all for being here. It's really an honor to be speaking with you today. I think very highly of the institution that's hosting this, the work that comes out of there. I think highly of Greg and Hayden, and this is really just very inspiring for me to share this company and to share these comments. I come to Merleau-Ponty. He's a very interesting philosopher in his own right, and I've read him for many years. But I came to him in a very intensive way when it came out that he had taken some very important lessons from Schelling late in his philosophical development. So I come to Merleau-Ponty first and foremost from Schelling, but not from Schelling in the sense of my deep dream in life is to get all my ducks in a row and just tell the most crystalline and perfect history of philosophy. But really, I think we philosophize for now, for the great issues, the great matters that are confronting us and are living and dying in the world in which we live. And so I've always read Schelling as somebody who I think still has something to say. And Merleau-Ponty also found in Schelling something important to say. So it's that issue. I mean, I want to think this from von der Sache her, as the Germans say, from the issue rather than just lay out all, Merleau-Ponty in stage 4.73, then thought this new thought, and this corresponds to Schelling. That's not my interest at all. Really, just the Sache selbst is what I want to think, and I want to think it in a very contemporary way. Those who want to get all the ducks in a row and get all those little stories about what corresponds to what, the Barbarian Principle, that volume that Greg mentioned, it's got all that in there. So that's all available anyway. And just rehearsing that again in public, I think, is not going to serve our interests. But I think this issue is a living issue. It's a living issue because the Anthropocene is a pressing issue for us all. And so when I speak of a psychoanalysis of nature during the Anthropocene, I'm really going to try to think this Sache that emerges between the two of them, something that Merleau-Ponty sees in Schelling, not just in Schelling. And it's not the case that Merleau-Ponty just didn't know what he thought until he read Schelling, and then Schelling was so amazing, then Merleau-Ponty became a good philosopher after that. That's a ridiculous story. Merleau-Ponty, whether he needed Schelling or not for this insight, is not so important. But what he sees in Schelling, given Merleau-Ponty's own development and his own course of thought, is just very interesting for us right now. And my key idea, my first way of naming the Sache that I'd like to put forth before you all is an effort to think in this confrontation the shadow of the Anthropocene. That's what I'm going to come out. That's what I'm moving towards. Or put in other terms, in the Anthropocene, how the earth appears as what Schelling and Merleau-Ponty call the barbarian principle. So that's my idea. And here we go. In The Philosopher and His Shadow, from the late collection of essays called Signs, Merleau-Ponty turned to the shadow cast by phenomenology's light. That is to say, what eludes philosophy, to what remains peripheral to our very desire to do philosophy, but which cannot thereby be dismissed from philosophy. I quote, "What resists phenomenology within us, natural being, the barbarian source Schelling spoke of, cannot remain outside phenomenology and should have its place within it. The philosopher must bear his shadow, which is not simply the factual absence of future light." I'm sure many of you know that passage. It's a very dramatic passage. But of course, phenomenology, phenomena, the shining forth, what's key to the shining forth of things is that which does not shine forth and which eludes all shining, even in shining itself. This is the invisible, obscured by the shadow of the visible, forcing philosophy into a chiasm, the crossing point or middle between the visible, the shining forth of things, what Schelling in the Freedom essay called existence, and the invisible, the groundless ground, the barbarian principle. As the Merleau-Ponty scholar Ted Tovine articulated it in his Merleau-Ponty's Philosophy of Nature, very good book if you're interested in this topic, this is a binocular ontology. That is, an ontology that recognizes the tension between both poles as constitutive of being. In the working notes to the visible and the invisible, Merleau-Ponty proposes, I just love this phrase. It's a loose phrase. It's, the French are very good at just these beautiful little poetic quips. But I just love it because although there's probably more rigorous ways to put it, it's just a beautiful metaphor. He proposes a psychoanalysis of nature that takes up the question of the ever new and always the same in nature. That is, the barbarian principle, the repressed shadow that haunts the shining face of nature. This strange phrase, psychoanalysis of nature, does not really rely on the work of Freud or Lacan any more than it relies on the analytical psychology of Jung. Furthermore, the turn to nature loosens psychoanalysis from its emphasis on individual or collective humans. Psychoanalysis in this case has more to do with being and its shadow. We will analyze this shadowy psyche by putting, is my proposal to you, by putting the Anthropocene on the couch. That's my idea for this time, our time together. Merleau-Ponty's decisive references to Schelling, however brief, stem from his late lecture courses on nature. And in my remarks to you today, so tonight for me, tomorrow morning for you, I briefly consider Merleau-Ponty's turn to Schelling, noting from the onset that the brevity of Merleau-Ponty's comments on Schelling do not consequently make them less decisive for the concerns that I share with you today, namely, to use its light to help expose, however paradoxically, the barbarian shadow that the light of the Anthropocene can expose. In so doing, I want to reflect for a moment on what it means to pursue this footnote in the history of philosophy. So, I mean, honestly, if you want to tell the whole history of philosophy, you can't say, don't read Hegel, just read Merleau-Ponty on Schelling. That would be an absurd thing to say. It's a small moment, but I think it's still explosive. As a chiasmic paradox whose very light illuminates the shadow of the Anthropocene. So we're going to first have to begin with the problem that we're trying to illuminate. What is the Anthropocene? This might be a review for some of you. I'll keep it brief, but it's good to have this on the table. In 2000, Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer, considering an astonishing accumulation of evidence and studies, wrote the following. Considering these and many other major and still growing impacts of human activities on Earth and the atmosphere, and at all, including global scales, it seems to us more than appropriate to emphasize the central role of mankind in geology and ecology by proposing to use the term Anthropocene for the current geological epoch. So it's not a climactic term, it's a geological term. It speaks to an age of the world, an age of the earth. To cut to the chase, their proposal is that this is the era of the anthropos as a defining geological force. The proposal was taken up in 2009 by the Anthropocene Working Group, and in 2016, at a meeting of the International Geological Congress, they recommended by a vote determined by a supermajority of the working group, 88%, that the Anthropocene as a geological time or chronostratigraphic unit replace that of the Holocene. I know the debate still goes on. I know it's complicated, and I know it's not really our time here to get into all the weeds of this issue. But that they're even considering it is all you need to know, that this is a very serious issue. This was the purported end of the Holocene. The Holocene, it's a really interesting word. That wholly new, from holos, whole, and kainos, new, chronostratigraphic unit, which emerged with the retreat of the glaciers and included the rise of anthropos as an increasingly dominant species. I mean, I know it's really important to emphasize that, we're not living just any old planet. We can't go to Mars. We're Earthlings, but we're not really even Earthlings. We're Holocenings. I mean, really, it's a second of the Earth that really is what we are. This new, since the Holocene was the new, this new, that is the Anthropocene, might not be as clearly linked as Crutzen and Sturmer had suggested to the onset of industrialization in England and Europe in the mid-18th century, but perhaps rather to what is sometimes called the Great Acceleration that began shortly after the Second World War. Great Acceleration is the Industrial Revolution in hyperdrive, with ever-intensifying population growth, itself congregating in increasingly urban areas, the fever-pitched burning of coal, oil, and gas to fuel a technological relationship to the Earth that has constitutively altered the Earth's geology, and in so doing, has locked in potentially catastrophic climate change for centuries to come, and sent many of its ecological systems into crisis. What is now new, or kainos, is anthropos. Not that humanity is newly arrived, but that humanity can now grasp itself as definitory of a chronostratigraphic unit. To be sure, this new geologically definitory creature unsustainably expanded its impact through an explosion of extensive growth. That is, through expanding its economic life by breaking through the ecological ceiling of its traditional affordances, the limits of growth that the respective lands of the earth had hitherto made possible. And this was done primarily through the burning of fossil fuels, especially in the form of petroleum. I mean, you compare it to Adam Smith. Adam Smith was brutal. Division of labor is the humiliation of labor. But he never could imagine that industrialization could blow through the Earth's ecological ceiling. Indeed, the very visibility of the human-oriented world has petroleum as part of its shadow. What is it now, newly, to be human? Who is this new anthropos that comprises an age of the world? It is no longer just to be this or that person, but it increasingly includes a way of being that is interrupting the relative climate stability of the Holocene a climate favorable to human emergence, and is redefining the conditions of the earth that grants it life. By some estimates, the acidity of the oceans has increased by 26% since the Industrial Revolution. 3/4 of all land mass not covered by ice sheets have now been compromised. A recent UN intergovernmental report on the pending extinction of up to 1 million species of plants, insects, fish, and animals with whom we share the earth is not only disheartening, but also revelatory of who we are. Not a classic phenomenology. It's not showing us the light of who we are. The shadow is beginning to emerge. But to be clear, it's a little bit like what Charbonnier has a beautiful analysis in his recent book. It's like a tragic revelation. We thought everything was going well. Never has life been so good. And next thing you know, we've killed our father, married our mother. Like we didn't see it. It really is something unconscious in our very relationship to each other and the world. But to be clear, this revelation is chiasmic. It reveals us in the light of the phenomenological day, while also insinuating a repressed shadow. Unless we imagine that the study of the history of philosophy is the fool's gold of merely setting the record straight on what was said when, this chiasm, light and shadow, nature and its soul, as one of Schelling's formulations, the Anthropocene and the shadowy earth, the visible and the invisible, is an ineluctable aspect of any possible psychoanalysis of nature and its confrontation with Schelling's barbarian principle. This is not, however, automatically to equate every anthropos with the anthropos of the Anthropocene. This is a side note, but I think it's very important. The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity, for example, rightly reports that indigenous peoples are often better placed than scientists, so these people who live on the shadows of proper culture, to provide detailed information on local biodiversity and environmental change, and are important contributors to the governance of biodiversity from local to global levels. Now, the repression of indigenous people, the repression of the earth, the return of the repressed in terms of those that we have repressed, showing us that our forms of repression are forms of a profound spatial alienation. We're here without being here. You know, the light of who we are casts an enormous shadow, a shadow so enormous that it could even prove fatal. Yet the same report does not fail to notice that indigenous lands are among the most vulnerable on Earth. They tend to be poor and under-resourced in the capitalist sense, and are consequently the easiest to exploit without legal repercussions. Quoting the report, they also suffer directly from the pressures of expanding agricultural frontiers and commodity production, such as mining, logging, and energy. The trend is perverse. It follows that the only humanity that matters to many of the global power structures is the self-destructive anthropos of the Anthropocene. The anthropos that would be lord and whose political and economic systems render other forms of humanity irrelevant, even expendable. As Andreas Malm argued, the position that the ecological crisis implicates all of humanity is the second greatest ruse after outright climate change denialism. I quote Malm, "Climate change has come about because a fortunate few have appropriated the bulk of the atmospheric carbon sink through massive emissions, which by definition cannot be extended to humanity as a whole." I mean, this rising tide lifts all boats, of course, it was never true. It was never physically possible. So he and others proposed that maybe a more scientifically accurate designation might be the Capitalocene, or there's other candidates, but in that direction, being a little more pointed to preserve that it's not every single human being whose shadow is being exposed. But really something that Malm says would be the geology not of mankind, but of capital accumulation. We can use this title broadly to include the ecological catastrophes of purportedly socialist and communist countries as well, all of whom compete for supremacy with capitalist economies and whose centralized states had their own ideological justifications for rampant capital accumulation and the burning of fossil fuels and other forms of ecological degradation. Such a perspective. So again, thank you for that. I mean, that is probably known to most of you, but I just wanted to have that on the table since we do have a particular analysand on the couch, to just do a little case study first. Such a perspective allows us to appreciate that a psychoanalysis of nature does not imply that the analysand is external to the Anthropocene, part of its surroundings or environment. So you take right off the table is environmental philosophy. As if the issue is something external to us, around us. That we imagine that the earth is external to us, a mere background or setting for the drama of human history, is part of what is being analyzed. The soul or psyche of the earth is not separable from the soul or psyche of the anthropos that governs the Anthropocene. This psychoanalytic trauma does not indict science as such. That's also a very important distinction. When science challenges the prerogatives of the rich and powerful, it too is vilified. Science is embraced, except, of course, when it produces inconvenient truths. The issue is rather the uses to which science is put. The crisis of the Anthropocene is inseparable from the crisis of science. Whose science will hold sway, and to what uses will it be put? In this way, so now, blah, 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 I'm coming to Schelling and Merleau-Ponty very directly. It turns out all along, oh my God, here's the freedom essay waiting for us to catch up with it centuries later. In this way, we can appreciate with fresh eyes Schelling's accomplishment when he argued in his famous 1809 freedom essay that, I quote, you all probably all know this if you read the essay, the whole of modern European philosophy since its beginning with Descartes has the common defect that nature is not present for it. That is the very shadow of our philosophical enterprise, and that it lacks a living ground. It's up there in the air, just imagining that its roots will just take nourishment from clouds. Now I'm going to start going. Now I want to get lots of good comments and outrage. I'm going to start saying, I don't know, first let Schelling put it in his own terms, because they're extremely provocative. Using the language of evil. Now, by evil, I don't mean the bad things that bad people do. That is not Schelling. That's not the freedom essay. Using the language of evil, admittedly quaint and sometimes embarrassing language that contemporary thought struggles still to use effectively and meaningfully. Schelling uses this gives this ancient problem a new valence as the crisis of scientific rationality casts an ancient problem in a new light. In the freedom essay, Schelling does not argue, as one might expect, that freedom, so we're all free and you can do good or bad things, That picture is off the table. That freedom is a predicate of the subject human. Freedom and the absolute are not at the disposal of the human, but rather at the ground of the human. To think from freedom, how does freedom have humanity? Freedom is not a property or an attribute of humanity, but rather the reverse. Freedom does not belong to us, but we belong to freedom. What is it to be a predicate of freedom as a human being? Key to my concern that I'm sharing with you today is to hear in the ground that precedes all existence the ancient resonances of what was once called phusis. And I don't even mean just the things that Heidegger does with it. I think the word is very rich on its own. Natura, remember natura, of course, is natality. It's birthing, genesis, creation, vitality, life. I'm speaking in China, Ziran, not Ziran in the contemporary sense of the nature and natural sciences, but the old Taoist sense of Ziran, so of itself. It is nature that at its ground is free, so of itself. That is how it emerges and appears, goes its own way rather than being made to go only our way. As such, it is so of itself, as Zoran indicates in its ancient register. As the ground comes forth as existence, the latter is what it is of necessity, and hence nature itself is a generative play of free necessity, natura naturans, nature generatively naturing, as Schelling repurposed Spinoza's memorable phrase. Yet what is inseparable in nature, ground and existence, is in humans separable. This always sounds like, what's Schelling coming for this? Why is this important? It's actually an extremely provocative suggestion. I mean, we're the part of nature that can act unnaturally. Evil is to invert existence and ground, to elevate the former above the latter. In turning ground and existence upside down, I imagine that it is I who am free, I who will be Lord of the earth, I who will bring nature to my beck and call. I mean, this was also already, I know this is really kind of in the weeds comment right here, but the famous debate between Fichte and Schelling, where they had a lot of things in common, and Schelling concedes Fichte's point, but what he thought Fichte really couldn't see is the limits of the problem of the subject. If the subject ends up being your point of reference, you really can't think the question of nature. And there is a way in which the freedom essay is also, it's many things. It's an interesting first shot against Hegel, but it's also of a piece with his ongoing worry about Fichte. I mean, this Fichte is, for all of his insight, the Fichte, at least, that Schelling read, this is the fall. This is the separability. I am the Lord of nature. In evil, I am tempted to become the ground, and as such, and this is Schelling's language, I annihilate nature. I make it nothing. I start with myself. It is I who am free. I mean, this has been the great posit, I think, of the modern project, that we will increase our affluence, that is our capacity to be free, and our capacity to be free really is to be measured by our capacity to limit being bound by our material conditions. Speaking of the fate of philosophy in his earlier lectures on the methods of academic study from 1803, Schelling called this the true annihilation of nature, analyzing and thereby atomizing as something external to us. Nature becomes present to the human subject, which now regards itself as the arche. What is first a spiritual fate eventually becomes, for Schelling, a literal one. Schelling was really quite prophetic on this. He just simply said, the modern project, it can't possibly end well. Die wahre Naturvernichtung. As Bruce Matthews has articulated it, I quote, the complicating yet all too obvious fact, however, is that we too are a part of this world and cannot therefore rip ourselves out of the ground from whence we live. End quote. One does not have to follow Schelling all the way in calling the ground of human existence the Godhead, in Eckhart's sense, to appreciate the force of his insight. In ecological terms, the ground of the earth is minimally the enabling conditions that render human existence possible. Yet this latter has a curious quality. What for the earth is inseparable, for example, what exists in an ecology is rooted in the ground of that ecology, is for humans separable. We can elect to go into runaway, for example. Or if we don't elect, we nonetheless can do it, not knowing that we're doing it. It's possible for us. If the existence within an ecology becomes unmoored from the ground of that ecology, its existence would come into crisis. Like root and branch, the ground and existence of an ecological system are distinct yet inseparable. Humans, however, can endeavor to break with their ground and render it peripheral. This was all Schelling's metaphors, and assume that they themselves are the ground. This is to become unmoored, rootless, and spatially alienated from the earth's enabling conditions. In evil, humans strive to be the lords of being, the queens and kings of nature, the dictators of an ecology. Evil in spiritual life is what sickness is in physical life, the inversion and consequent breakdown of the enabling relations and the eventual collapse into ruin and death. That's just my gloss on one of the central arguments in the freedom essay. Whether or not we still want to, or even can, speak of this or anything else as evil, Schelling's insight remains prophetic. The modern period, not to be separated, it turns out, from Crutzen and Sturmer's initial location of the Anthropocene in the dawn of the industrial age, marks a decisive turn from the earth as a ground to the rise of the human subject as a ground. I mean, this is why it was so key that the Naturphilosophie not be sucked up and nature not be thought from the starting point of the subject as it is in Fichte. Anthropos has become the Archimedean point. The earth is appropriated in the terms of the human as ground. Schelling already knew that this story was going to end badly, and it sure looks like he was right. The earth, or more precisely, specific earth conditions, not only grant the current ecologies of life, but they also grant a certain human form of life. The human possibility of inverting ground and existence, and thereby asserting the human being as the ground and reference point for life. The Anthropocene. I mean, in a way, although Schelling could not have imagined the geological force of his intuition, it's already there. That philosophy begins confronting the shadow of the Anthropocene, a Minority Report on modernity. This in turn gives rise to two commanding paradoxes for our time. One, The Anthropocene is the result of the human assertion of itself as ground. As we saw with Schelling, the existence of humanity is grounded, but human beings have the freedom to ignore this ground and make themselves and their desires and ideologies the ground of all things. The human being is grounded in such a way that it can reverse its original peripheral relation to its grounding and enabling conditions and act as if it itself were the ground. This is the logic of the Anthropocene. Human beings imagine that they are the lords of the earth. Paradoxically, however, the ecological crisis demonstrates the folly of human hubris as the earth reasserts itself as ground. It is not a set of subjugated and neutralized background conditions, and it is not yielding to the command of anthropos. Solutions that imagine that the ecological crisis is merely an engineering problem merely double down on the problem. That was Rex Tillerson, Secretary of State, first of many under Donald Trump. But Secretary of State, former oil magnate. It's just an engineering problem. Shadow. 2. In this sense, the Anthropocene, the age born of the strivings of the most fortunate among the anthropos, in turn gives rise to the grim discovery that it is the soul or psyche of the earth itself that is Lord. It is the return of the repressed. That's one way to understand the ecological crisis. It is the grounds of the earth that made possible the form of life that reversed this order. But in so doing, it now brings this humanity into stark relief. The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth, or at least the Holocenic earth. Ultimately, it is not at our disposal, but we are at its disposal. And hence the second paradox. The age of the new anthropos, that is, the age of the anthropos that acts as if it had and was the force of the earth itself, gives rise to an age whose internal logic is inimical to the survival of the new anthropos. It is the age that, in being marked by the new human, sets into play the grounds of the self-extinction of the human. The self that would be Lord is the self that eventually cannot be at all, and which precipitates its own demise along with the many other life forms with which it shares this current regime of life. Life cannot isolate itself on the periphery of its enabling conditions, again, periphery, that famous move in the Freedom Essay, alienated from its ground, and expect to flourish. Although, for Schelling, humans certainly strive to do so in evil. In this sense, it is instructive to remember that evil is to our spiritual life what sickness is to our physical life, Schelling's famous analogy in the Freedom Essay. If we do not attend to it, the fever flares and the wound festers. Our grief at a climate increasingly hostile to human habitation reveals that our pretensions to be the master and proprietor of nature were perniciously delusory. Next section. The shadowy soul of the self and the phenomenal world. Let us return to the issue at hand. The psychoanalysis of nature as it emerges in the nexus between Schelling and Merleau-Ponty, as this encounter becomes legible in a new way within the context of the Anthropocene. To take up the project of a psychoanalysis of nature is to enter into an analytic relationship with the psyche, the psyche of nature. In other words, it asks that we re-engage the anima mundi of the ancients. Psychoanalysis of nature is clearly what it's referring to. Nature is vital, animated by its psyche or anima. Otherwise, what is there to psychoanalyze in the psychoanalysis of nature? At the same time, the sensibilities that have governed Western and increasingly global thinking for the last 4 centuries would find such a project absurd. Merleau-Ponty's proposal is an affront to the manner in which the environment appears as something obvious to us, a collection of resources and objects for us to discern and to use. But this is not at all lost on Merleau-Ponty. The question of a psychoanalysis of nature is the task of rethinking nature in its repressed strangeness. Its light obscures an originary shadow, what Schelling called the barbarian principle. This Merleau-Ponty is like, yes, I dig this. This is important. But how do we think this barbarian principle, this nomadic shadow that haunts the near side of manifestation, resisting our settled modes of thinking? Its first, albeit indirect, hint, to speak in the language of a psychoanalysis of nature, is the trauma suggested by nature's resistance to its reduction to dead, or Schelling, following Hamann, will even say in 1807, murdered resources. I mean, that nature, we study it as a form of nature side, for a discerning and consuming subject. Nature is made, nature is turned into resources to be appropriated and put at our disposal, bent to the political and economic aims of those who purport to study it. In the Freedom essay, Schelling calls the repressed, forgotten, or otherwise subjugated shadow erste Natur, that which is an incomprehensible ground, and another, it's just a super famous phrase, a nie aufgehende Rest, an irreducible remainder that cannot be resolved by reason, even with the greatest exertion. I mean, this is also part of the complexity of the thought. You can't grasp it and therefore make its unconscious disappear. The shadow first emerges, but this is not the key point, but it's first hinted in its resistance to being thought, the shadow it casts on our phenomenological aspirations. Merleau-Ponty, following Schelling, call this remainder this excess of being over the consciousness of being. Hence, you can see why I speak of a psychoanalysis of nature, as what Schelling wants to think in all its rigor. I mean, this is really what he said. This is why, he's not going to, I don't think, I can never imagine Merleau-Ponty reading the philosophy of mythology or Revelation. That's just not Merleau-Ponty. But this thought, he thinks is really, really key. What Merleau-Ponty calls an excess of being in his gloss is his gloss on what Schelling called das Übersein, that is, the shadow cast by nature's self-exposition. To make this point another way, we can turn to its articulation. This is a parallel example just to suss out the thought. Say, for example, in Deleuze and Guattari, who at the end of their great period of philosophical productivity argued in What is Philosophy that, and I quote, "We will say that the plane of immanence is at the same time that which must be thought and that which cannot be thought. It is a non-thought within thought. It is the base of all planes, immanent to every thinkable plane. Irreducible remainder, the groundless ground, the Ungrund. The shadow of all possible philosophy. A plane of immanence is the phenomenon that determines the horizon of a philosopher's conceptual creativity, indicating what belongs by right to their thinking. The horizon of philosophical concept creation, of thinkability as such, always casts a shadow that the philosopher must bear. The problem of non-thought, what simultaneously must and cannot be thought, is not another tiresome lamentation about the sorrows of finitude. It is the effort to unleash the powers of thinking shadow. This is what Schelling, too, is saying. This is not like, oh, no, we can't do that. Oh, you can't go there. Oh, constantly rehearse and bang our heads against the limit. Schelling, this was a deeply, for Schelling, even religious thought to unleash this. Deleuze and Guattari. Perhaps this is the supreme act of philosophy, not so much to think the plane of immanence as to show that it is there, unthought in every plane. There's lots of other ways to think it too. I have a couple other suggestions that I could bring up in our discussion, but I'll come to my third and concluding set of thoughts. Let's return to this problem of the soul. And first, I'll just say this, Schelling on the soul, he starts speaking like that. Wow. I mean, you thought evil was a hard sell, soul, no buyers whatsoever. But Schelling did not think that we had a thing called the soul. That is not the teaching of the soul. The soul is the shadow, and it's a shadow of human beings. But in the same way in which I wanted to suggest that the shadow of a human being is the shadow of the earth itself. Oh, what did Schelling write? Oh, yeah. Die Weltseele, the world soul, the anima mundi, the deep, shadowy psyche of being and human being. And the term, as Schelling uses it comes from Meister Eckhart. So, Greg, you have a good Meister Eckhart expert among us right here. There's a reason why, for example, the Zen folks from Kyoto, they really like Meister Eckhart. It's not because they think that the Buddha taught us that by anatman we meant we had a soul. No, that's part of their critique. That's the Seneca heresy, that there is some deep thing that we are that keeps coming back or is at the base of everything. The soul in Eckhart was the self beyond any possible manifestation of the self. And it runs parallel for Meister Eckhart to the thought of the Godhead. The Godhead is super, super important in the ages of the world. It appears all the time. Remember what Eckhart says? I pray to God to rid me of God. It is the shadow even in God itself. The absolutely unthinkable, and no matter what you say about it, the shadow just displaces again. It's the unconscious even of God. The soul, of course, the Godhead is to God as the soul is to the human being. It's the shadow. Beyond, and of course, to the extent to which you can think of God as in any way phenomenologically relevant, it's hard to imagine what that would mean. But even if it could be, it's not the Godhead. It's the shadow. And I just a couple of lines from Schelling just to make sure that I'm not just selling a bill of goods. Here's Schelling. The soul in the person, therefore, is not the principle of individuality. It's not your really real individual thing. Rather, it is that which one is lifted beyond all selfhood, any possible appearance of yourself to yourself, and through which one becomes capable of sacrifice of oneself, of selfless love, and what is the highest, of contemplation and knowledge of the way of things, and even art. Art's got soul, but art becomes possible when we get out of the way of art. Or we could put it one other way. Nishitani makes this point, famous Kyoto school philosopher, because you can think of it like this. We imagine that, we're somehow able to make the human being the measure even of the highest religious virtues, let's say agape or love or something like that. He simply quotes Matthew's gospel. Matthew's gospel, the sun shines equally on the good and the sinful. It shines equally on the good, the best, and the worst. You know, to love the world the way God loves the world has nothing to do with anything that is personable. It's absolutely impersonal, indifferent, a shadow beyond anything that we can imagine. I mean, agape is not like an ethical thing that we should do. It's a shadowy thought beyond any possible human calculation. Another thought from Nishitani also. Again, we can see how this whole thing is getting set up. To call it a shadow, that's how it first appears, because it's what's not being thought and what you're thinking. It's what's not appearing and what's appearing. Um, Nishitani calls this really. This is he regards this as one of the less fruitful ways that existentialism went. It just appears as I thought deep down I was the lord of the earth, and I look at myself, and suddenly I find there's nothing there below myself. It's wholly ungrounded, and this huge abyss opens up. And we're all talking about the abyss all the time. And of course, it appears as an abyss. It appears as Kyomu, what he says is this hollow nothingness, simply because you assumed that you were yourself and the world was things for you. But for Schelling, it appears the shadow also is everything. It's the earth that we've betrayed. It's the earth that we have absolutely no relationship to. It's really another symptom of our spatial alienation of the Anthropocene, that when suddenly we see that our view of the earth and our view of ourselves is totally ungrounded, we all become anxious existentialists, and it just falls away into nothing. It's got a soul. The soul is not someplace external. It's what's not appearing as what's appearing. None of this was lost on Merleau-Ponty, I would say, who in his late lectures on nature said about Schelling that he contended or sought to place us not in front of, but rather in the middle of the absolute. It's no longer an object for a subject. We're of all of this. We're of the shadow, but even the shadow, of course, it's always calling attention to our original position and its assumptions. This psychoanalysis of nature evokes Schelling's prescient book, The Weltseele, both by recalling ancient and modern, but not modern, philosophical wisdom, and anticipates the reappearance of Gaia, the universal organism, as a possibility for contemporary natural science, which, I quote, renews the ancient understanding of the earth as a living subject rather than an inanimate object. Because after 400 years of being virtually shelved by dominant mechanistic and reductionist perspectives, not only is anima mundi unabashedly expressed in Gaian literature, it has been turned into a research program, an interdisciplinary field charged to investigate it. This is the words of Kristen Rinker. Gaia, biosphere, geophysiology, Earth system, maybe more controversially, living organism. It's just a metaphor. But really, we don't have to get lost or stuck on the metaphor of a superorganism. I know it's got pluses and minuses. We could just say, well, okay, minimally it means at least this. If one thinks of the late Bruno Latour's turn to Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis, it was not so much for his descriptive prowess or his rigorous scientific modeling. That, admitted, has problems, a very loose metaphor, as is psychoanalysis of nature. But it was a way of naming the Earth's capacity to resist its technological subjugation and to reemerge, as Latour thought it was doing, as a political subject with autonomous political interests. It's the Minority Report on the global order, the Earth itself. Merleau-Ponty provocatively characterizes Schelling's philosophy itself not so much as a science of nature, not as a theory of nature as a discernible object for a thinking subject, but rather as a thinking of the Ungewusst, as a phenomenology of pre-reflective being. Thinking attempts to retrieve its original oblivion not as something wholly other and utterly elsewhere, but rather as its interior shadow, its ever concealed yet ever manifesting soul, Seele, anima, psyche, again, all very loose. It's a kind of radical anamnesis, the endeavor to remember that one has always forgotten, to somehow become conscious again of the unconscious of nature itself. Why don't we start there? It's at 8 o'clock. That's exactly my time. I think that's what I got. I look forward to your brilliant questions. I try to say a lot of extremely provocative things so that you'll have plenty to complain about, and our conversation will be interesting.
Thank you so much, Jason, for the really wonderful talk. I've clapped virtually and I've clapped physically now. Okay, so for our discussion, this is how I'd prefer to do it because we have a lot of people in the room. If you'd like to ask a question, please send me a message in the chat, just to me individually. So that's, you can find my name there, Greg Moss, and you just write your name in the chat, and then we'll unmute you and let you ask the question. Okay. Yes. Okay. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put it in the chat, send it to me, and then I'll put you in the queue. We also have people on YouTube. If you're on YouTube and you want to ask a question, you can just type your question in the comment section there, and then one of us will put you in the queue and then read your question for you. Okay, so that's how we'll roll. Okay, so floor is open for questions. Okay, so we have our first question. Let me go ahead and all right, Max, I think you should be able to ask your question. Oh, you're still unable to. There we go. There we are. Go for it. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for Jason. Was really great, and thank you for organizing this this talk. I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed it. I have one very simple question, and it relates in part to my research on the Tao Te Ching and all the discussion of Tao, Yo, what there is, what there is not, and the fact that Tao is often described as Wu. When you talk about the shadow, sometimes it seems that it's a transcendent element. No, you refer to God and to this shadowy element presenting God itself. But in other parts, in the majority of your talk, you discuss in a very concrete terms as something that is there. No, the ground is a groundless, but this doesn't mean that it's nothing. So I don't really understand if you consider this shadow absolute nothingness or something that is groundless but still present.
Yeah, that's a very excellent question. And you listened to me very carefully, so thank you. Yeah, that's really the rub. So first of all, I think I'll put a few things on the table. Schelling does not think that among the class of things that are, one of those things is a thing called God. God does not exist. God is not a being. This is also Meister Eckhart's position. God is not a being in another dimension or not elsewhere. There's not things that are, and then some special other place where there's another class of things that are, or even in the class of things that are, there's this amazing thing called God. That's not the thought. For Meister Eckhart, whatever you would think about God, the thought of the Godhead is God's shadow. But that shadow is not elsewhere. It is the shadow of all things and all people. So the Godhead in a human being is, you could call it the soul, but really it's nothing. But not nothing as in I thought there was something there and then there's God, it's not like my bank account. Like I go running to my bank account to buy some new books and I go to take my money out to pay for my books and there's nothing in there. Nothing like that at all. It's everything. So, I mean, there's a way in which even Nishitani will even take the bait and say we could call it God. We could call the Tao God, but not because you're trying to turn the Taoist tradition into, or the Buddhist tradition for that matter, into something theistic, or to add some kind of posit that would be completely unimaginable in those traditions. It's a way of thinking the shadow in its importance, in its vitality, in its generativity, in its the Tao and the 10,000 isn't, the generic statement in which, oh yeah, whatever you point to me, it's the Tao, and we just have some general conclusion about things. It's the demand that one is attentive to things as they are, not in general, now and here. And I would say, wow, what could also not, it's one of the reasons why the East Asian traditions are so incredibly fruitful for trying to dig ourselves into some clarity about the ecological crisis. Um, in some ways, I would even honestly would really push me that the better than Schelling. But what I like about Schelling is that he's figuring this out in the trenches. He's figuring it out at the scene of the crime. He's not coming to it outside. He's really able, really prophetically, to sort out how these things are going to go. But it's really important to avoid the following: some two tiers of existence. That everything's an appearance, and behind it there's some unappearing, mysteriously never appearing thing, or even a thing called nothing. I mean, I think that's always the trick. I mean, the problem in the Kyoto school, for example, of a relative nothingness is it's always relative to how the shadow first appears. I thought there was something, then relative to that, at the ground, there's nothing, and the whole thing is like Sartre, still mysteriously still himself, but standing on a sea of nothingness. No, you going the other way around. It's thinking from the Godhead, thinking from emptiness, thinking from Tao, thinking from Tao that allows one also to understand the relationship to the shadow, not simply as the limit or the abyss or even the irreducible remainder. And those are always pointing out the initial mistake, which is though we imagine that things are just things and they are as such for us, the most important thing among things, the judge of all things, the proprietor of things. The other thing that, when Schelling speaks of the soul, for example, I think this is very interesting in an East Asian sense, because he's taken this also from Meister Eckhart, again, someone who really resonates in some very important ways with these traditions by their own admission. The thought of the soul is what undoes me as a center. It makes me capable of self-sacrifice, makes me capable even of dying for another. It has nothing to do with the ego or the subject or the myself as the inaugural point of view. All that being said, I think you're really right also to say that using the word God is a little bit tricky. I mean, with Meister Eckhart, it's to what extent can it be as fully free of not being elsewhere as, say, emptiness or Tao or these kinds of moves? It's tricky. It is very, very tricky. But I think Eckhart at his very best, it's not, the 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 repressed thing at the heart of our visible world. There's no surface and depth in the final analysis. Rather, it's reality.
Great. This wonderful exchange. I think next we have Ben, if you don't mind asking your question.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much, Dr. Wirth. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
All right, my question is actually kind of a follow-up, and yeah, I want to say this in all respect, as someone who, in many ways, is engaged with religious and spiritual practice myself. How can we talk about this or use or see as a help Schelling and Merleau-Ponty's approach to the unthought, to non-being, to the shadow when dialoguing with sincere people of faith from any of the world's religious or spiritual traditions, for whom a certain devotion to or conception of Godhead and hence of praxis is hard to challenge. It's hard to kind of there's certain things where you can't see the shadow, and I respect that. I mean, yeah, even for secular people, there will be those things for sure. So I'm just curious how we kind of, I mean, you can even go ethically and say, well, there's no shadow to the Holocaust. That's just bad, in some absolute sense. But maybe more specifically with religious traditions, how do we kind of engage that shadow side or the unthought, the unspeakable?
Thank you for the question. It's a hard question. The nice thing now is I'm talking to philosophers and at the local church saying these things. I'd have to really have a very different strategy in order to come across as in any way helpful. And again, my paper is not to disrespect anyone, but I would say, first thing I would say is religious people are not in the dogmatic sense that you're also raising. It's not like they're doing something crazy that no one else is doing, and the secular world is so mature and on top of things and sober, and the world of the Enlightenment has got it all right, and these wacko religious people believing in unscientific objects are the outliers. The Enlightenment has its deep shadow. I mean, this is what Schelling and Merleau-Ponty are still struggling with, the shadow of the Enlightenment. So the Anthropocene is not, the following is unconvincing, that we believe in some philosophically untenable thing, and the result is we dominated the earth and now are confronting our possible self-extinction. I think that's not the Anthropocene. I think it's even not quite right to say that, by saying that we're lords of the earth, that this was a conscious decision in which we said, I know we shouldn't be doing this. I know it's a really bad idea. I mean, what's really hard about this thought is the Enlightenment was the promise of freedom for all, of lifting people out of poverty, of having a more rational relationship to things that earlier ended up in war. Turning an economic corner so that our life is not so desperate and short. That's also the shadow. The shadow is in our good things. The shadow is in our best of intentions. I recall in this respect also, just now to go back to the religious side of things, it's tough. I mean, I live in a country in which to be religious for some people means you enforce your position with a gun. I don't think that's particularly religious, but that's the country I live in. I don't think I want to talk to somebody whose possible retort to me would be to shoot me. I'm just not going to have that conversation. But I would say this, Meister Eckhart had to defend himself before the Inquisition. So it wasn't like he came from an eerie, earlier, cheerier day. I mean, Eckhart really is, Schelling really is, Merleau-Ponty really is. These people really are. They're a minority report on our world, our global world. I mean, they're really working on its shadow. And it's not a shadow just cast by our mistakes, it's even our triumphs. I mean, there is a way in which, the ecological crisis also had that at its core, however impossible it always was from the beginning, that we'd all get together as a world and live with less material need and more autonomy, more respect. Yeah, okay, we fight wars all the time. They get bigger and bigger. But that was not, the original design by anybody. The Anthropocene isn't, by evil, you mean a consciously chosen malicious choice between two alternatives, one of which you knew was good, the other was bad, and you did it. I mean, for Schelling, we don't even know that we're doing it. And so to say there's something very evil in someone's religious piety, that is Schelling's position, by the way. If you think his thought all the way through, not evil as in, malfeasance or malevolence, but really just a certain stubbornness in which you associate yourself and the stability of yourself with your beliefs. Schelling did not think that was the religious thought. Merleau-Ponty is not a particularly religious thinker, does think that this is also part of the shadow. The psychoanalysis of nature is capitalism, but also how we are religious, the Enlightenment, science, all these things. So I don't know, how does one have a psychoanalytic conversation about even the dark side of our greatest virtues? I mean, the whole world has organized itself so that we could all participate in, some sense of shared economic project that will have had catastrophic consequences. But I don't think that the motivation for that order was, I know we're going to destroy the world for our grandchildren, but I just feel so good to be rich. I don't think that's really what it was. I mean, well, so it's really what's potent about this too is it's, the thought of the psyche is a thought of something that is something has to dig deep at. And it's not going to be caught at the surface level. But also, I think religion, whatever is left to be said about it, I think a lot is to be. I mean, I'm a Buddhist priest, so I think something could be said about it. But the people you're speaking about are not inviting me to come in and give a sermon ever. We just we have our dignified tolerance for each other. It's hard. It's really hard. I think really, I mean, the intergovernmental report from the UN, they're saying that what it will take to respond to the current crisis that we're in is a level of change that has never happened in the history of our species. It's really hard to draw from that. Okay, well, you put it that way, let's change. It's hard. These are hard issues. That's why I really like the metaphor of a psychoanalysis of nature, to really just push, to try to suss out our constitutive delusions, religiously, economically, politically.
Great. Let's keep going here. This is, I think, Dennis, you're next. So the floor is yours. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Greg. I'm audible, I assume?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Wirth, for, well, pushing some buttons. I guess that's what you wanted to do. So definitely work with me.
Good.
Not so much when you talked about Kyoto School. When people talk about Kyoto School, I'm like, yeah, good. But when people start talking about the French, then I'm especially triggered. So I want to, like, this question of a psychoanalysis of nature is extremely interesting. And I want to, I think, take a Schellingian take that makes a turn to walk the path that I think Bataille would walk. So if we follow Schelling for a minute and we think of ourselves as in nature, thinking nature, so that we're basically self-thinking nature, to put it that way, Then if you think about a psychoanalysis of nature, then what's happening is that nature is both on the couch and what is doing the analysis, right? It's sort of the self-analysis, the self-psychoanalysis of nature. And I think especially Foucault is very good at showing us that psychoanalysis is basically confession for atheists. Okay, it's still sort of a Christian thing to be doing. It's confession. So you could construct this the self-psychoanalysis of nature as the confession of nature, nature confessing what it is, right? And now I'm sort of interested in what at the ego level would nature be telling itself? And what at the id, to be very Freudian Lacanian, would nature be not be telling itself that it ought to confess about, that it is actually also, right? And I think, and I want to push some buttons here as well, and then here I follow Bataille, I think. What if at the ego level, being on the couch, nature tells itself, I'm so generative, I'm so motherly, if only everybody would follow the Zen Taoist path, then people would know what I'm really about. I think that's the ego level confession. I think the id level confession is what people possibly really don't want to face or hear. And the id level confession would be, actually, I am destruction. I am waste. I serve no purpose. I create to destroy. That would be the id level confession of nature of itself, I would say. What do you think of such a reading?
I like Bataille a lot. I like your question. I think it's a very provocative question. I think you'd be an interesting person to have a long conversation with. And there's so much in your question. I'm just going to pick a couple of things. One, I don't think again, the notion of psychoanalysis I'm using very, very loosely, because really it's not a Freudian psychoanalysis. Nature does not have an ego. It's not confessing. It doesn't have anything to say. It's not emerging in that way at all. It doesn't have any repressed past that somehow we can try to suss out to the surface. So in that way, it's really not, psychoanalysis really is not a good metaphor because it has all of those suggestions. But it is the psyche, it is the anima mundi. It is the Weltseele. So I'm just picking on that psyche sense, that very, very limited sense. And trying to draw out that on the flip side of a phenomenology by which, I don't know, I'll put it this way, we imagine that we are what we are. That's the ego. And we imagine that the earth is its manifestations. So that would be its ego element. But that's our projection. That's not the earth. The earth is not up to anything. The soul is impersonal, indifferent, has nothing to say. That's all true. There's nothing to confess. It's indifferent to whether or not we come or go. It didn't cry tears when the comet came and 65 million years ago ended life as it was. It's not a tragedy for the earth. It's not a tragic structure. It doesn't love us. None of these things. The soul of the earth really is shadow. But what I like about your turn to Bataille, of course, is Bataille is one of those thinkers who, in all of his always very interesting ways, really experiments with letting the religious thought be something that is not self-serving to us, that is not deeply and fundamentally serving our interests. Pity the person who imagines that the general economy of the earth is akin to someone changing a tire. The Anthropocene is we change the tire of the earth so that we could drive its car and it's us. I mean, the shadow is, there is a Bataille-esque element to it. I can't imagine Merleau-Ponty or Schelling ever writing with the drama or the provocative studies that Bataille does and has. But he's really, really good at saying that the religious thought is at its very deep level, not akin to our interests, not akin to our world, not akin to even saying that the earth itself has a shadow, and the shadow is exposed in the context that I'm talking about tonight in the Anthropocene. Part of the climate change is we thought the earth was about us. We thought the earth was our mother. We thought the earth would just help us with all the bounty that we wanted. And its counter report isn't, I have other plans for you. Its counter report is, if you would like to continue to live on this earth, which, by the way, is of no, it's not a key issue for me, not a key issue with the shadow. You're gonna have to really first see that our global order has cast an extraordinary shadow. That's what I would say. And again, I think the Bataille connection would be a very fruitful discussion. I would look forward to a conversation with you in the future, because when Bataille writes about a Hegelianism without reserve, I always said, well, dude, you just should read Schelling.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay. Very, very, very interesting exchange. So let's go to Shuishan here. Let me ask you to unmute. You got it?
Okay. Am I heard okay?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, Jason, for this wonderful talk. Yeah. I don't know if you still remember, we met 2 years ago in Estonia.
I remember you very well. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to see you. And I want to build on the previous great questions. I want to focus on this notion of shadow, and I would like to maybe understand it from more epistemological and ontological perspective. So I think this notion of shadow reminds me of some of the I think a lot of discussions in the history of Western philosophy. I may just list a few, like from Kant. To Kant, I think he thinks that shadow belongs to a type of nothing. It's one of the four types of nothings for Kant. Is like a nothing of lackness, because shadow lacks light, just like coldness lacks heat. So it's a type of nothing. Also of course, for Heidegger and for Merleau-Ponty, I think we can all link this notion of shadow to the notion of the invisible. Like the invisible is not the non-visible. It's like a sort of positive indeterminate, just as what you said, it is a type of like relative nothingness. So I want to maybe push more on this side to ask whether you understand shadow as a type of entity, a type of Sein, even if it's like a primary or the highest sort of Sein, or it's just like a sort of space or horizon, like a type of Lichtung, like in which we understand things. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's another very, all these questions are so good and very rich. I would put it like this. The discourse on the shadow should first be thought in terms of what location makes it thinkable as a shadow. And what makes it thinkable as a shadow is your starting point, in which you imagine that the job of philosophy is to give an account of what things are, or even if one's to think about ontologically, that ontology really is deep down fundamentally about being. That's not how the term is used since Heidegger, but that historically it was something like that. That really it's the realm of light that casts a shadow. But what the shadow is doing is it's opening up a realm in which the realm of light, which we imagine to be what things are, and then is there some little extra thing that's a shadow? No, it's the realm of light coming to its edge, coming to its limit, coming to not just because it can't see everything, there's always more to see. It's the invisible is the realm of the unseen, but maybe not seeable by us, but still there somehow to be seen, something to see, or if we had different eyes, we could have seen it. Nothing like that at all. The shadow is the shadow of reason, of description, of our world, of even the best possible account of our world. But again, so the shadow in this way would be relative to our starting point. It appears as a shadow. But of course, the tricky thing is what the shadow is saying, if you continue that thought, is that our starting point was the problem. Our starting point always makes what we cannot see and have not seen appear as a shadow, as a limit, or as elsewhere, or as, the unthinkable, or all these kind of negative theological tendencies that somehow repurpose themselves in contemporary philosophy. The shadow is opening up the repressed, but the key is to try to think not the limits of the visible, but to think the visible and the invisible, that binocular place, ground and existence. But of course, even calling ground in Schelling, it's always from the perspective of existence that it appears as ground. But in itself, you try to find ground, there's nothing there. So relative to existence, it's not a ground. It doesn't exist as something called a ground. So Grund is Abgrund. But really, in itself, it's neither a ground nor an absence of a ground. It's Ungrund. It's only appearing that relatively. But it's the invisible is not relative to the visible. There's always something invisible, and that is the shadow. No, the invisible makes us think about the visible differently. I put it in very simple ecological terms. The Earth is basically invisible to all of us, even in very basic ways. How is that? I imagine the following is true. If most anybody who's living on Earth right now were just to be dropped in the middle of a forest, all of our thoughts about the Earth as the Earth Mother and loving us, and we should just be more kind to it because it's so kind to us, and all that's true in a certain level. But here's what would happen. We'd be in the middle of this forest. We'd have no idea where we are. We have no idea where the trails are. We'd have no idea where we're going to sleep. We'd have no idea how to get food. And suddenly this world would appear as an absolute shadow, because it would simply appear as a shadow because our whole orientation in space is based on the reorganization of the world fueled by petroleum, such that it is laid out in a way that accommodates our needs and desires. But beneath that, or beyond that, or otherwise than that, when the Earth simply appears as something you don't know what to do with, it could be terrifying. It appears abyssal, but again, it's not abyssal. The Earth's not abyssal. We're not children of the abyss. There'll be no human beings if there's some horrible abyss out there. What the abyssal quality, but I like how Nishitani put it, the kyomu, the empty hollowness of how nature would appear and does appear in the Anthropocene. We thought we remodeled the whole world to make humanity better, and next thing you know, we're hurtling towards catastrophe. And what is this Earth anyway? And suddenly it appears hollow and empty and terrible, and what's going on? But it's not that. It's not that at all. Well, then what is it? It's not an it. To be spatially located is to have to pay attention. To think from its center. Remember, this is what evil was for Schelling. To leave the center and to rethink things from the periphery, as if the periphery were the center. But the center, again, it's just a metaphor. It appears as a center because it's been lost and you think about it from the periphery. But really, the shadow is the earth that shelters us. You know, it's unthinkable. It's not a thing in itself. It's not a Vorstellung. It's not not a representation. None of those things. But it is also that if we pay attention to it, we would share life with other forms of life. And so to really think about it, something in itself that is not going to be a thing, but not just a relative nothingness or an absence or a hollowness. It's life. It's everything. It's why there is something rather than nothing, which is not explicable from the something that is not nothing. The
Thank you very
barbarian
much.
principle.
Sorry. Yeah.
Great. Before we go on to Hayden, just briefly, someone asked if you have a paper you could share with these ideas, or whether this is something that is not shareable yet at this point.
Yeah, if they don't mind it having a few parts that are a little rough, I'll be very happy to send it to you, and then you can share it with whoever wants it.
Okay. Okay. So just as just to let everyone know that if you want to see this in writing, you can email Jason. This is okay. Okay.
Yeah, and it won't have footnotes or anything like that at all. So if you want sources and things like that, you can just email me, and I'll tell you what the sources are.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, Hayden, one of our co-hosts, please take it away.
Hey, first of all, Jason, just thank you so much. The talk was so rich. I took away a ton of insight and inspiration from it. Inspiration maybe to read the freedom essay. Let's see. Next reading group, Greg.
Next reading group. Next reading group.
Oh, it's one of the masterpieces of the really that entire century.
I think
Yeah.
definitely, Hayden, because you've been reading early Schelling, so we've been prepping you for this event.
Oh, okay. You were just warming me up.
One should be prepped, though. This is my cautious approach.
Okay, thanks. So a tempered enthusiasm to give that a try. But I especially loved how you were able to apply his thought there to thinking about what's going on in the Anthropocene and a kind of psychoanalysis of the Anthropocene. That was very, very rich. So thank you for that. Just to follow up on Dennis's question, this is just a brief comment. Yeah, I was wondering if there's any way to think of nature as what's being analyzed, a psychoanalysis of nature through that axis of natura naturans and natura naturata, in that the naturata, maybe there's some kind of parallel to ego naturans, something like the more concealed side, the aspect that we don't see very often, and maybe having some id-like properties. Anyway, just a thought that came to mind. So I'd be curious to hear if you think that makes any sense or if that's a direction that conversation could go. But I think what I wanted to ask you, I have so many more specific and even technical questions, but in the spirit of your talk of sticking to die Sache selbst, I'll ask one that's just very kind of topical and thematic, which is, I think at one point you said that we are earthlings in a very fundamental or maybe even essential kind of way. And I guess I wondered if I should interpret that statement more ecologically or more kind of existentially. So here's a scenario to consider. Suppose this spatial alienation that we've been undergoing as humanity has moved more into urbanization, civilization, this kind of thing, the sort of enlightenment taken to its extreme, the idea that we are freedom, or that we have the freedom taken to extreme rather than the other way around. Suppose we take that as far as it goes and we solve the engineering problem, not by fixing nature or fixing the earth, but by becoming an interplanetary species, as some people have optimistically prophesied that we will. What does that scenario look like from your kind of Schellingian psychoanalytic of nature perspective? And yeah, what does that say for our understanding of what it is for us to be essentially earthlings? What would your take be on that scenario? Is it conceivable at all? And how does the analysis continue if we were to ever end up there?
Thank you for that question. It's a rich question. So two questions. First, the natura is both naturans and naturata.
Yeah.
Naturans is the shadow of naturata. It's a hard thing to think. Science was in the 19th century the survey and classification of natarata and the laws by which natarata becomes the natarata that it is. And that casts a shadow. And there is a way in which that particular conception of science, not the only conception of science, science is also awesome and amazing in so many ways and so far beyond this, some of its deepest practitioners. But there still is some deep sense that science will be that by which we become, as Descartes said, the master and proprietor of nature. And that casts a shadow. That's the Anthropocene. The master and proprietor of nature is staring at its own shadow and only so far only looks at it as if it's empty and hollow. But the key is to think beyond that position. And then your second question. Yeah, I love that question. I have to say this. You know, there's a passage in the third book of Herman Broch's The Sleepwalkers. And if you know that novel, that's one of my favorite novels. And the third part takes place during World War I. And one of the characters is in a trench and there's gas and bodies everywhere. And he goes, wow, you know, the reason why this is not driving us crazy, the reason why World War I did not drive us crazy is because only crazy people would do World War I. that we have world wars is totally insane. That the Anthropocene is insane on some level. It's totally insane. That's also another thing I can say about the psychoanalysis of nature. You suddenly see yourself and go, wait a minute. Can't we see how crazy this is? So, okay, someone tells me we are not going to be able to live in the climate into which we evolved to flourish. We can't do that in any way whatsoever. But we are going to figure out how to live on Mars. That's insane. If you can put someone to live on Mars for a few days, good luck, I guess. I don't know. Be pretty lonely, pretty good. Where would you go? What would you do? What vacation would you take? It's insane. You know, I think, wow, I mean, machines are pretty amazing, but, on one level, machines are, you study nature in order to use something from nature, a machine, in order to turn a corner on nature, use nature against nature with a machine. And you can do that to complement nature. It doesn't have to be antithetical. Or you can just use it to have your way with things. And the more machinically we live, first of all, machines completely mediate our sense of space, adding both to our alienation from our own soul and the soul of the earth. It's an extremely difficult thing. Again, it's not machines as such. It's particular global use of machines, which is the point in which the subject will never even notice that they're a subject because, A, they're too machinic even to remember they were once somehow soulful. And then two, the machines just continue to produce and produce and produce. So we become more machinic, yet we continue to contribute to the Anthropocene in such a way as the shadow looms larger and larger and larger. We start saying things like, we'll seed the skies. We'll have, we'll spend trillions of dollars on some carbon capture, that could just be done by, but don't burn any fossil fuels. That's easy. Don't do it at all. That's not cost you any money. But we'll spend trillions of dollars sequestering carbon. Oh, then we'll be living on Mars. Oh, and then, well, I'm sure we'll figure it out. Oh, and by the way, we already know lots of things to do already anyway, and we won't even do those. It's not like we have to hope for a miracle. That we can't even do the things that we know we need to do, that science is already telling us would really benefit our ability to live in our home. We won't do any of that, but we'll get Mars right. I have to say, at a certain point, this is the madness of the Anthropocene. that it's a sickness. It's very interesting because early Schelling, even the idea of the philosophy of nature, you have to step outside of nature in order to look at it or to consider it. But here's the problem. If you step out of it in order to consider it, stepping out of it means you're not simply of nature, pushed along with it. You get a little step back, a little reflective distance on it in order to be able to consider what is nature. But here's the problem. If you end up there, it's you and nature. You have to really be able to step back so you're not just moving along with nature, but then step back in and still be of it such that it's not alien to you and something that you're simply looking at as Fichte did, is something opposing your freedom and opposing your will. But we look at this as, we will even conquer space as a solution to the fact that our desire to conquer things is precisely the crisis in which we're living. So I say to those people, I don't know. I would say I would recommend psychotropic medication. I would recommend therapy. I would recommend, I don't know, mind-altering drugs. I don't know, maybe that'll click something back in your head. I don't know, mushrooms, LSD. I don't really know. But it's utterly symptomatic of the Anthropocene, is what I would say.
Any brief? Did you have another question, Hayden, or were those two combined already?
I'll take one more really brief comment. Yeah, thanks so much for the reply, Jason. I just wanted to make sure someone said a name that I don't think I've heard yet in an hour and 50 minutes, which is Husserl, because of course the Philosopher and His Shadow is primarily about Husserl. And just the one observation that I made when you were talking about Schelling saying that the movement of modern philosophy has been a kind of Naturvernichtung, a denial or even annihilation. No, was it a Naturannihilation? Naturvernichtung, annihilation. Annihilation of nature. I just couldn't help but see the parallel, obviously, with Husserl in Ideas 1 and his Weltvernichtung thought experiment, which is itself, he says, grounded in the absolute freedom of the phenomenologist. And that's a moment in Husserl where nature becomes nothing other than the kind of, projected, the object for the subject. So I just couldn't help but notice the parallel there. And I think in some respects, there's a kind of critique of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty in which Husserl plays Fichte to his Schelling or something along those lines. But of course, the other thing to say is that he also recognizes the other Husserl for whom there's another vision or understanding of nature kind of breaking through. And I don't know that there's anything comparable in Fichte that we could be equally charitable towards. I'm not sure. But it was just a really profound resonance for me when you made that comment. So I just wanted to share that remark on Husserl.
That's a brilliant comment. Thank you. I completely agree. And it's absolutely spot on. And for Fichte, of course, Fichte kept philosophizing after his discussions with Schelling. So, by Fichte, we mean the Fichte that was the Fichte during until 1803. Fichte also became more complicated. I think, honestly, he thought about his own position from Schelling's critique and gave it some credence. So there's Fichte. The story of Fichte is we're not done with it. And again, the argument was never that Husserl or Fichte are wrong. It's that position casts a shadow, and some shadows are very serious shadows.
Thanks so much for that exchange. Since we're running short on time, maybe I'll ask my own set of questions to finish off the conversation. So thanks so much, Jason, for coming and thinking about and talking about the absolute with us. I wanted to ask you two questions. I have a whole list, but we only have 10 minutes. So I'll just ask these for now and bother you later by email. Yeah, my first question is about God and the absolute in relation to the Anthropocene, and we've already touched on that, and you touched on it at length as well in your paper. I wonder if we could also think about the alienation that we experience in the Anthropocene, or that is at least operative in the Anthropocene, is also, we could describe it as as an alienation from the absolute. When we posit ourselves as the lords of nature, or are we positing ourselves as absolute, as a kind of unconditioned principle? And so could we consider this resistance on the side of nature to our treating nature in this exploitative way, et cetera, as a kind of resistance of the absolute? So that's my first question, is this, because one of the beautiful things about the freedom essay is that it's a treatise really on the absolute. It's thinking the absolute, and he's a thinker of the absolute, and so for me it's a very essential and important feature. So what I'm also wondering is, what are we forgetting? We're forgetting a lot of things, but is it a problem when we forget the absolute? Is becoming forgetful of the absolute itself a problem and a symptom? So sometimes I'll give a talk about the absolute at a conference, and people are like, what does that have to do with philosophy? And I think, well, it has everything to do with philosophy. Right? What are you doing? And second, maybe we don't even think it matters at all, when yet it's one of the central themes of Schelling's freedom essay, or we don't think that we're treating ourselves as absolute when we lord ourselves over nature. Right? We don't even know that we're actually taking a position on the absolute. So that's my first question. I'm just curious what you might make of that. And the second question is also about the way we think in the Anthropocene. And in your response to Hayden, I was really struck by the language of insanity and madness. Because, yeah, what we think about as reason and rational might in fact be madness. It might in fact be a kind of heightened irrationality. Right? Someone may be listening to our talk and think, well, Jason used a lot of paradoxical language. He's talking about the unthought, even used the word paradox sometimes, thinking the unthought, the ultimate, the original ground is the unground. We have these paradoxes that keep showing up when we're trying to think the shadow or recognize the shadow. So someone might think, are we advocating a kind of irrationalism here? Of course, when you read Schelling, you discover that he says things like, reason is the place of truth. And so it does seem that Schelling himself is offering an alternative vision of reason in the freedom essay. And that in fact, what you're doing here is very rational, but not in this insane enlightenment sense. So I'm just curious what you make of the diagnosis of thinking in the age of the Anthropocene. What we hold to be rational. Is it really rational? And then what does reason look like? Or what is a reason that isn't sick? What does it look like? So thanks.
Thank
So
you.
I hope I could get across the basic idea of the question there.
Yeah, those are both very awesome questions. Thank you. I'll take the second first and try to use that to open the door to the first one, which I'm extremely sympathetic to both questions. Of course, we're irrationally rational. I mean, that's the thing. Rationality is not self-warranting. It's locally warranting under certain conditions, in certain ways. We should be rational. It's good to be rational. But our uses of rationality are irrational. It's irrational to use rationality to destroy ourselves as if we were saving ourselves. That can't really be a really robust fruit of it. But it's interesting also because the level of madness, Schelling does have a very interesting discussion. It kind of his interesting anthropology of thought at the end of the Weltalter. And I've always found that very, very striking. Because really there's three kinds of people on all of Earth, three positions for your mind. One is to simply be insane. But insane, like you're not an insane form of rationality. You're just crazy. You think you're Jesus and all this stuff. That's one type. The second type is what he calls the Verstandesmensch. So the one who really wants to capture everything in the concept, including the absolute. Well, what kind of concept is that? What can we do with it? What do I think it is? As if I can look at this thing as something separate from me, so to your first question, and say yay or nay, good or bad, true or false. Well, Schelling doesn't say it's insane, really. He's actually much crueler than I am on it. He says it's imbecilic. It's a certain form of madness, and it's the madness of stupidity and the immense aggression in stupidity. Remember, stupidity is, I don't know, it's a dubious etymology, but we think it means something related to stupefaction. As in, you look at something and you just freeze. You can't do anything with it. You're frozen and the whole world freezes. And of course, what the absolute is it's not elsewhere. It's not something. It's not true or false. It will appear indirectly as a shadow or the irreducible remainder, but that's only because locally, you've stupidly frozen things into their concepts. Um, but we're of the absolute. The Tao is, and I would say by absolute, we should say absolutely absolute rather than relatively absolute. And that is a thought, especially in Schelling, and especially what made Schelling attractive, with some caveats to thinkers in the Kyoto school, the ones who liked him, but they all liked him a fair amount. He does really have the thought of the absolutely absolute, and it appears relatively absolute only as it exposes the stupidity of how we normally live and think, that the world will be what we represent it to be, or the shadow will simply be, we can only represent it to what we want to be or reduce it to some phenomenology, but beyond that, it's just a limit. It's nothing. We don't have to pay attention to it. A thing in itself is just neutrally stashed, in some little zone that you can just, maybe put to work for ethics, but really it doesn't belong to nature. It's just the unthinkable. So that was stupid. The third type was someone who works with the absolute, which for Schelling was someone who tries to get an upper hand on madness and tries to be reasonable about, the ground, the absolute, which is not of reason, not for reason, but reason has to relate to it. Otherwise, it goes over the edge and it's simply crazy, or it's stupid. And this is the hard thing, because for Schelling, the Anthropocene exposes the imbecility of the human project. And I would say, really, yeah, it's crazy to go want to live on Mars. But I'd honestly say, it's crazy that we would be that stupid. That's absolutely imbecilic. That would ever occur to us that we can keep burning fossil fuels. That just change the subject. Keep voting. Keep burning them because, the jobs. We need the jobs. It's going to be no jobs. It's a, yeah, here's the thing. I mean, Schelling really thought that most philosophy was imbecilic, and it was because it could not relate to the non-philosophy in all philosophy. What will never become philosophy, but which is absolutely key to philosophy. I think really that's a very obscure way to put it. In part, that's the power I find, thought from a certain angle, of the East Asian traditions. I mean, they're just thousands of years of thought and embellishment on what this means. And not only to think it like I do, which is going into it through the back door of the disaster of our imbecility. I put it this way, when Emperor Wu asked Bodhidharma who he was, I don't know. This knowing I do not know, not even in the Socratic register of, I know that I don't know the answer to my own questions, but in a very deep knowing of absolutely unknowability, not as something out there, but what in itself is never known, which then recasts what it means to know what we know in its living, generative, fragile, attentive way. I mean, the Anthropocene is a time of sleepwalking on the earth. We're not paying attention. That there is, I think at the imbecility of how we live. I live in a city. You all live in cities. Hong Kong's a big city. You know, there's nothing wrong with cities, but we think of cities imbecilically, as in, you know, the complete place in which we have our way, and then throw in a few parks. You know, the natural world should be the model for our cities, as it was, say, in the ancient city of Xi'an, or it's the city that replaced it, Kyoto. You know, to live less imbecilically with the absolutely absolute, to pay attention, to nurture it, to be present to it. So if you want to be a philosopher, I would say this: you know, you don't have to call it the absolute. The absolute is a way of backing into it, because it appears as absolute based on its refusal to be countenanced in the imbecility of what you imagine to be philosophy. But you can call it by many things: the Godhead, the Tao, Buddha nature. But it is the very possibility of doing philosophy. And this is also what Merleau-Ponty also gets from Schelling. The Philosopher and His Shadow. You know, you cannot do a phenomenology. You cannot give it an account of the visible register of things without a binocular sense of its shadow. And by shadow, I mean it's absolute shadow. It only appears as a shadow because you're starting with the visible.
With that, Jason, let's end there. I think as a final word, it's most fitting. So yeah, I want to encourage everyone to think the absolute absolutely. And thanks so much again, Jason, for coming and for talking with us and having a really a wonderful conversation. Yeah.
Oh, thank you all. It was a long time, so thank you all so much. I'm really an honor to be in your company, and Hayden and Greg are just treasures, and I really enjoyed meeting those of you who I did, and I hope to see you all sometimes in Hong Kong or here in Seattle or wherever else we have a chance to enjoy each other's company. And keep up the good fight and be kind, and thank you all.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Jason.
All right. Have a good night, Jason. Have a good day. Good morning, wherever you are in the world. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.